In the aftermath of World War I, the world looked toward peace, stability, and rebuilding. But instead of a pathway to healing, the Treaty of Versailles became a breeding ground for resentment, anger, and future conflict. Signed in 1919, the treaty was supposed to mark the end of the Great War and lay the foundation for a peaceful Europe. Instead, it laid the groundwork for another, even deadlier global conflict. For many historians, the Treaty of Versailles was not just a flawed peace, it was a deeply unjust and vengeful document that planted the seeds of World War II. Germany, the defeated nation, bore the brunt of the treaty's harsh terms. Under the agreement, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, an admission known as the War Guilt Clause. This was more than just symbolic. It served as the legal foundation for demanding reparations, which would cripple the German economy for years to come. The final amount, set at 132 billion gold marks, was astronomically high and beyond Germany's capacity to pay. The economic burden, combined with the humiliation of being solely blamed for a war that had involved multiple powers and complex causes, left the German people bitter and disillusioned. Territorially, the treaty stripped Germany of significant land. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The Polish corridor was created, giving Poland access to the sea and cutting off East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations control, and all overseas colonies were taken away and redistributed to Allied powers. These losses weren't just geopolitical, they cut deep into German national pride. Millions of ethnic Germans found themselves living under foreign rule, and the sense of betrayal and victimhood spread rapidly through the population. Militarily, the treaty imposed severe restrictions. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, conscription was banned, tanks and aircraft were forbidden, and the navy was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. To a proud nation that once boasted one of the strongest military machines in Europe, this was a national disgrace. The message from the Allies was clear: Germany was to be punished, not rehabilitated. In Germany, the reaction to the treaty was one of universal outrage. It didn't matter whether someone was conservative, liberal, or socialist, the common sentiment was that the treaty was a diktat, a dictated peace with no negotiation or justice. The new Weimar Republic, which had just replaced the Kaiser's monarchy, was blamed for accepting the treaty. Many Germans viewed their leaders as traitors, and this perception contributed to political instability, assassinations, and violent uprisings in the years that followed. The treaty not only failed to secure peace, it poisoned the legitimacy of the very government that signed it. Outside Germany, some voices warned that the treaty was a mistake. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who had proposed a more lenient peace based on his 14 points, saw his vision dismantled by European leaders who wanted revenge. The U.S. Senate ultimately refused to ratify the treaty, and the United States did not join the League of Nations, further weakening the New World Order. British economist John Maynard Keynes famously criticized the treaty in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, predicting that the harsh reparations would destroy the German economy and cause political upheaval. His warnings proved prophetic. The economic consequences of the treaty became starkly visible in the 1920s. Germany struggled to make reparation payments, leading to hyperinflation, unemployment, and social chaos. By 1923, the German mark had become virtually worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows, and savings were wiped out overnight. In such desperate conditions, extremist parties began to gain traction. Among them was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by a charismatic veteran named Adolf Hitler. He, like many others, viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a betrayal and used its injustices to fuel his rhetoric and attract support. Hitler's early political rise was rooted in the promise to undo the treaty, restore Germany's lost pride, and punish those who had stabbed the nation in the back. The idea that Germany had been unfairly treated became a central narrative in Nazi ideology. As he gained followers, the treaty's legacy continued to shape political discourse in Germany. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, one of his first major objectives was to defy the treaty's terms, rebuilding the military, reclaiming lost territory, and asserting Germany's dominance once again. The treaty that was supposed to end all wars had, in effect, set the stage for another one. The story of Versailles is not just about diplomacy gone wrong. It's about how peace, when built on punishment and humiliation, can fester into something far more dangerous. Rather than healing the wounds of war, the treaty reopened them. It did not reconcile nations, it radicalized them. It did not build stability, it bred resentment. And it did not prevent conflict at all but guaranteed it. As the 1920s unfolded in the shadow of the Great War, the global economy appeared to be on a path of cautious recovery. But beneath the surface, economic fault lines were widening. By the end of the decade, the entire world was plunged into a financial catastrophe that would help usher in the most dangerous ideologies of the 20th century. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, did more than just break economies. It broke trust in governments, democracies, and institutions. It shattered people's belief in stability and fueled desperation that would soon be channeled by radical movements across Europe and beyond. Germany was among the nations hardest hit by the collapse. Already reeling from the harsh economic terms of the Treaty of Versailles and a decade of political instability, the German economy was built on fragile scaffolding. Much of its recovery during the 1920s had been propped up by American loans under the Dawes Plan. When Wall Street crashed in 1929, those loans dried up almost overnight. Foreign capital fled, banks failed, and the already shaky German financial system collapsed. Factories shut down. Unemployment soared. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were out of work. The middle class, which had barely recovered from the hyperinflation of 1923, was wiped out again. Many families couldn't afford food, heat, or rent. Poverty became widespread, and so did political anger. As economic suffering deepened, trust in democratic institutions eroded. The Weimar Republic was seen as ineffective and weak. Voters turned toward parties that promised radical solutions. Communists gained ground on the far left, while the far right offered another message, one of national rebirth, revenge, and restoration. The Nazi Party, once a fringe group, capitalized on the economic despair by blaming Germany's troubles on Jews, communists, and the so-called traitors of Versailles. Hitler portrayed himself as the only man strong enough to rescue the country, rebuild the economy, and restore German greatness. Germany was not the only country affected. The economic collapse spread across Europe and even reached Asia and Latin America. Britain faced mass unemployment. France dealt with waves of strikes and a loss of global confidence. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already taken power by 1922, using similar rhetoric about restoring national strength and pride in the wake of economic and social dislocation. The Depression only strengthened his position. In Spain, economic hardship and political division would soon explode into civil war. Across the continent, democracies struggled to survive under the weight of mass poverty and extremist ideologies. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin took a different approach. While capitalist economies floundered, the USSR used the moment to promote its centrally planned system as a viable alternative. Through brutal industrialization and collectivization, the regime promised progress and stability, even as it purged millions of its own citizens. The apparent success of the Soviet economy during this time gave communism greater appeal in countries where capitalism seemed to be failing. This added another layer of fear and polarization in Western societies, especially in Germany, where anti-communist sentiment became a powerful rallying point for the Nazis. The United States, deeply affected by the Depression, turned inward. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal helped alleviate some of the domestic crisis, But America's focus on recovery meant it played a limited role in international affairs during this period. This retreat from global leadership created a power vacuum that authoritarian regimes were quick to exploit. With no strong international coalition to challenge their rise, fascist leaders grew bolder. The League of Nations, already weak, failed to respond effectively to the growing threats. Economic desperation had given dictators the stage, and no one was stepping up to stop them. In Japan, the economic crisis also fueled militarism. As exports collapsed and unemployment rose, Japanese leaders pushed a policy of expansionism, believing territorial conquest in East Asia could provide the resources and markets needed for recovery. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, signaling a new era of aggressive imperialism that further destabilized global peace. The League of Nations condemned the act but did nothing to enforce consequences, emboldening other powers to follow suit. The worldwide economic collapse created a perfect storm: populations in crisis, governments unable to cope, and extremist ideologies offering simple answers to complex problems. Fascism, Nazism, and militarism all gained traction in this fertile ground. Leaders like Hitler, Mussolini, and militarists in Japan promised revival through power, unity, and expansion. They promised to tear up old treaties, restore lost territories, and build empires. The Depression didn't just weaken economies, it made war seem like a path to salvation. People no longer believed peace would deliver prosperity. They believed strength would. As the 1930s progressed, the world watched the rise of fascist regimes in Europe with growing unease. Germany under Hitler began rearming in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Mussolini's Italy pursued military adventures in Africa, and Japan expanded its imperial reach in Asia. Despite these clear threats to global peace, the major Western powers, especially Britain and France, chose a path of avoidance and negotiation over confrontation. This strategy became known as appeasement, and it was based on the hope that by conceding to some of the demands of aggressive powers, future conflict could be prevented. In theory, it was meant to protect peace. In practice, it gave dictators the time, confidence, and space to push the world closer to war. The origins of appeasement were rooted in the trauma of World War I. The brutal conflict had cost millions of lives and left Europe shattered. No one wanted a repeat of that devastation, especially not over distant or disputed territories. Leaders like British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain genuinely believed that war could be avoided through diplomacy and compromise. They viewed Hitler's early demands, such as revising the Treaty of Versailles or uniting German-speaking peoples, as reasonable and potentially just. Many British and French citizens sympathized with the idea that Germany had been treated unfairly after World War I, and that allowing some revision might stabilize Europe rather than ignite it. But Hitler had no intention of stopping with modest revisions. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct breach of the Versailles Treaty and a major gamble. French troops could have easily forced him back, as Germany's military was still too weak for full confrontation. But France, without British support, chose not to act. Hitler interpreted their silence not as peacekeeping wisdom, but as weakness. It was the first major test of appeasement, and it failed. The next flashpoint came in 1938 with the Sudetenland crisis. Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia surrender its German-speaking border regions to Germany, claiming he was merely protecting ethnic Germans. Czechoslovakia, a sovereign nation and a democracy, was prepared to resist. It had alliances with France and the Soviet Union and possessed a strong, modern army. But instead of backing its ally, Britain and France pushed Czechoslovakia to yield. The crisis culminated in the Munich Conference, where Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and French Premier Daladier met, without any Czech representatives, and agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland. Chamberlain returned home proclaiming peace for our time, But the real result was a green light for further aggression. The Munich Agreement is often cited as the pinnacle of appeasement. It demonstrated that Hitler could get what he wanted through threats without firing a shot. It also exposed the West's unwillingness to stand up for smaller nations or confront tyranny directly. Czechoslovakia lost its key defensive borders and was left vulnerable. Just a few months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his ambitions were not limited to uniting German-speaking populations, but aimed at outright conquest. Appeasement was not merely a failure of policy, it was a failure of understanding. Leaders underestimated the nature of the regimes they were dealing with. Hitler was not a traditional statesman seeking negotiated outcomes, but a radical ideologue bent on expansion, dominance, and racial supremacy. Mussolini, too, was not seeking security for Italy but prestige and empire. Appeasement treated these dictators as rational actors with finite goals, when in fact their aims were limitless and rooted in dangerous worldviews. The policy also had devastating psychological consequences. It emboldened aggressors and demoralized potential allies. Nations like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states saw that promises from Britain and France could be hollow. In contrast, Hitler became convinced that the democracies would not stand in his way, no matter how far he went. Every time he was appeased, his domestic popularity soared, and his regime gained momentum. Appeasement was not universally accepted. Figures like Winston Churchill warned against it, arguing that peace could not be preserved by surrendering to bullies. But their voices were often dismissed as alarmist or warmongering. The memory of the last war loomed too large, and the desire to avoid another one blinded many to the reality unfolding before them. Public opinion in Britain and France only began to shift after the full occupation of Czechoslovakia. By then, the window to stop Hitler without war had already closed. In the years following World War I, Germany was left a fractured and weakened nation under the strict terms of the Treaty of Versailles. One of the treaty's most significant restrictions was on Germany's military power. The German army was limited to 100,000 troops, conscription was banned, the Air Force was disbanded, and the production of tanks and heavy artillery was strictly prohibited. These limitations were designed to prevent Germany from becoming a threat again. However, as the 1930s unfolded, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime began systematically violating these restrictions in a calculated and deliberate effort to restore German military might and prepare for expansion. The remilitarization of Germany was not an overnight decision, but a step-by-step process that tested the resolve of the international community. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, he inherited a military that was underfunded and severely limited. Yet from the beginning, he made it clear that rebuilding the German armed forces was a central goal. Within a year, he withdrew Germany from the League of Nations and the World Disarmament Conference, signaling his intent to pursue military independence. In 1935, Hitler openly defied the treaty by reintroducing conscription and expanding the army far beyond the 100,000-man limit. The Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, was established in secret and then publicly unveiled. New tanks and modern weapons were produced in factories that had long pretended to manufacture civilian goods. Each of these steps was met with little more than diplomatic protest from Britain and France. The international community, still committed to avoiding another war, hoped that Hitler's moves were limited and defensive in nature. But far from being defensive, Hitler's military buildup was part of a broader ideological vision. He believed that Germany needed Lebensraum, or living space, which he intended to acquire through conquest in Eastern Europe. A strong military was essential to that plan. In 1936, Hitler took another bold step by sending German troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone along the French border. This move was a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty and the Locarno Pact. German generals at the time admitted that if France had responded with force, they would have had no choice but to retreat. But France did not respond. Neither did Britain. The failure to act emboldened Hitler and further exposed the weakness of the League of Nations as a peacekeeping institution. The League of Nations had been created after World War I to prevent future conflicts through collective security and diplomacy. But during the 1930s, it repeatedly failed to live up to that mission. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League issued condemnations but imposed weak or ineffective sanctions. Its inability to enforce decisions made it increasingly irrelevant in the eyes of aggressive states. By the time Germany began openly violating the treaty, it was clear the League had no real power to stop it. The failure of the League and the passivity of Britain and France also sent a dangerous message to other powers. It indicated that international agreements could be broken without consequences. Hitler took full advantage of this. He increased military spending dramatically, creating jobs and reducing unemployment, which won him support at home. German society became increasingly militarized. Youth were trained in paramilitary organizations, propaganda glorified military service, and the nation was reoriented around the concept of war readiness. The rise of German militarism did not go unnoticed. France, alarmed by Germany's growing strength, built the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the German border. But the Maginot Line was a defensive measure, and it reflected the broader reluctance of France and other countries to engage in any kind of offensive military response. Britain, still recovering from the economic strain of the Great Depression, was hesitant to commit resources to military expansion or confrontation. Instead, both nations clung to the hope that Germany's rearmament could be managed through diplomacy. Meanwhile, the German army, now renamed the Wehrmacht, grew stronger and more advanced. Military leaders conducted secret training exercises with the Soviet Union before relations soured. German industry was mobilized to produce cutting-edge weaponry, and the foundations were laid for blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare, a fast and devastating style of combat that would later shock Europe in 1939. The violation of the Versailles Treaty and the unchecked militarization of Germany was not just a series of broken rules, it was a transformation of an entire nation into a war machine. And with every tank built and every soldier trained, the world moved closer to another conflict. In July 1936, a military uprising erupted in Spain that would grow into one of the most brutal and complex conflicts of the 20th century. What began as a civil war between a democratically elected Republican government and right-wing nationalist rebels led by General Francisco Franco quickly became an international proxy war. The Spanish Civil War became a battleground not only for Spain's future, but for the ideologies and ambitions that were tearing Europe apart. For Hitler and Mussolini, it was more than just an opportunity to support a fellow fascist. It was a testing ground for new weapons, strategies, and alliances that would later be used in World War II. The war exposed the deep divisions between fascism and democracy, communism and capitalism, authoritarianism and republicanism. On one side stood the Spanish Republicans, a coalition of left-wing groups including liberals, socialists, communists, and anarchists. They were supported by the Soviet Union and thousands of international volunteers, many of whom saw the war as a fight against the rising tide of fascism. On the other side were Franco's nationalists, monarchists, conservatives, and fascists, who received direct military support from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. For Hitler, Spain provided the perfect opportunity to achieve several goals at once. First, it allowed him to strengthen diplomatic ties with Franco, who could one day become a useful ally. Second, it gave the German military a chance to test its new air force, the Luftwaffe, in real combat conditions. This led to one of the most infamous episodes of the war, the bombing of Guernica in April 1937. German planes, supporting Franco, launched a devastating aerial attack on the small Basque town, killing hundreds of civilians. The bombing shocked the world and demonstrated the terrifying potential of modern air warfare. It also served as a clear warning of what was to come for the cities of Europe. Italy's involvement in Spain was equally significant. Mussolini sent tens of thousands of troops, along with aircraft and tanks, to aid Franco's forces. His goal was to strengthen the fascist movement in Europe, expand Italian influence, and showcase Italy's military power. The Spanish conflict allowed both Hitler and Mussolini to collaborate and form deeper strategic bonds. Their cooperation in Spain laid the groundwork for the Rome-Berlin Axis, a formal alliance between the two powers that would reshape the European balance of power. Meanwhile, the Western democracies chose a policy of non-intervention. Britain and France, fearful of escalation and still haunted by the trauma of World War I, agreed not to provide military support to either side. This policy was officially framed as neutrality, but in practice, it favored Franco's nationalists, who were receiving massive aid from Germany and Italy. The Republicans, desperate for weapons and supplies, found themselves outgunned and isolated. The Soviet Union stepped in as the only major power supporting the Republican cause, but their aid came with heavy ideological and political strings attached. The Western refusal to confront fascist aggression in Spain only encouraged Hitler and Mussolini to believe that the democracies would not resist their ambitions elsewhere. The Spanish Civil War became a rehearsal for World War II in more than just tactics and weapons. It also served as a psychological and political turning point. It revealed the weakness of international cooperation, the collapse of collective security, and the growing polarization of European politics. The war drew sharp lines between ideologies, and those lines would soon cut across the entire continent. It gave authoritarian regimes the confidence that their enemies were unwilling or unable to respond. It emboldened them to take greater risks, knowing that outrage would be met with inaction. Franco's eventual victory in 1939 marked not just the fall of the Spanish Republic, but a symbolic defeat for democracy and anti-fascist resistance. Spain became a dictatorship, but more importantly, the war confirmed the effectiveness of fascist military power and international coordination. It proved that large-scale war could be waged and won, even against ideologically diverse opponents. For Hitler, it offered validation of his military vision and ideological mission. For the rest of the world, it was a missed warning, an early glimpse of the destruction and tyranny that would soon engulf Europe. In August 1939, just weeks before the outbreak of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact. Officially known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after the foreign ministers of the two nations, the agreement pledged that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack one another or support any enemies of the other. Behind the scenes, however, the pact contained a secret protocol that was even more startling, a plan to divide Eastern Europe between the two powers, with Poland as the primary target. This agreement not only cleared the path for Hitler to invade Poland without fear of a Soviet response, but it also revealed just how far both regimes were willing to go to pursue their strategic interests. For years, Hitler had made it clear that he saw the Soviet Union as both a racial and ideological enemy. Nazi ideology considered Slavs to be inferior and communism to be a dangerous threat. Yet, despite his long-term hatred for Bolshevism, Hitler was pragmatic. He understood that Germany was not yet prepared to fight a war on two fronts. Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence and made clear that any German invasion of Poland would mean war. But Hitler was willing to gamble that those nations would back down if he could neutralize the threat from the east. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, had its own reasons for entering the pact. Stalin did not trust the Western powers, especially after being excluded from key diplomatic discussions, such as the Munich Agreement. He saw Britain and France as unwilling to confront Hitler, and he feared that they might try to redirect German aggression eastward. Stalin also wanted time to strengthen the Red Army, time to expand Soviet influence, and time to prepare for an eventual confrontation. The non-aggression pact gave him that breathing room. And in the secret protocol, he saw an opportunity to reclaim territories lost after World War I, such as eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stunned governments around the world. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were considered mortal enemies, one fascist, the other communist. Their sudden cooperation defied ideological logic, but it made strategic sense for both. In effect, it was a temporary alliance of convenience, built not on trust but on mutual interest. The fact that the two regimes could put aside their public hatred and make such a deal demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism of both dictators. Within days of the pact being signed, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the border, launching a coordinated assault using blitzkrieg tactics, fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry. Britain and France, realizing that appeasement had failed, finally declared war on Germany. But their response was slow and largely symbolic at first, offering little immediate help to Poland. Then, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, as agreed in the secret protocol. Polish forces, already overwhelmed by Germany, were caught in a pincer movement and stood little chance. Within weeks, Poland was crushed and divided between the two invading powers. The Nazi-Soviet pact marked the final collapse of the fragile peace in Europe. It showed that Hitler was willing to work with anyone, even his ideological opposites, to achieve his goals. It also exposed Stalin's cold, strategic calculations and his willingness to sacrifice other nations for Soviet advantage. The pact undermined the notion that ideology alone drove totalitarian regimes. Power and opportunity often mattered more. The world had underestimated just how quickly and decisively these regimes could act when left unchecked. The aftermath of the pact was grim. In the territories seized by Germany and the Soviet Union, mass arrests, deportations, and executions followed. The populations of Eastern Europe were subjected to brutal occupations. In some cases, German and Soviet forces even cooperated briefly on the ground, coordinating movements and dividing resources. The destruction of Poland was not just a military conquest, it was a political message. It proved that international agreements, promises, and treaties meant little in a world governed by dictators who saw diplomacy as merely a tool of war. The Nazi-Soviet pact also complicated the moral landscape of the conflict. For a time, Stalin's regime appeared as a collaborator with Nazi Germany, despite later positioning itself as a victim and liberator in the war's later stages. This brief cooperation tarnished the Soviet Union's image among many and fueled tensions that would later define the Cold War. For Hitler, the pact bought him the time and security he needed to expand his war westward. For Stalin, it secured territory and delayed a conflict he knew would eventually come. And for the rest of the world, it was a final, undeniable sign that peace was over and a far more devastating war had already begun.